Hello and welcome. This VPAL signature event is brought to you by Harvard's Office of the Vice Provost for Advances in Learning. Thank you for joining this afternoon. We'll be talking with Ethan Rouen. Shareholder capitalism arose in part as a way for corporations to participate in strengthening democratic institutions to combat the Soviet Union. As concerns posed by communism have faded, the new threats of environmental degradation, social unrest, and authoritarianism have become prominent. In this talk, Professor Ethan Rouen of HBS will discuss how capitalism is evolving to address these issues and what tools are needed to maximize private sector participation in developing solutions. With that, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. It's really nice to, well, not see you all, but I appreciate you sharing this beautiful spring day with us in Boston. So I want to start by laying out the goals here. My goal is not to endorse nor condemn capitalism. In functioning democracies, the economic systems should address the needs of the societies in which they operate. And as those needs change, we should see evolution. And that's what we're seeing here in the United States. As the threats of the 20th century have faded, it is becoming more and more apparent that the threats we face today are environmental or climate change, inequality, authoritarianism, private sector capture of the political system. And so business has is evolving to address this. But the problem is that the tools that business need to do this effectively are lagging. If you think just about accounting and the financial accounting system, I like to think that, trying to value a modern firm using financial statements, which look largely like they have for the last century, is not dissimilar from trying to repair a Tesla Model S using a manual for a Ford Model T. You'd look at the outside and they would look fairly similar, but the second you open the hood, you realize you were in trouble. So with that, capitalism has had a pretty good run over the last century. The free market has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty since 1990 alone. We see growth in our life expectancy due to advances in technology, advances in our diets. But with these physical comforts, we've started to see costs that are becoming more and more difficult, if not impossible, to ignore. Every day, people are impacted by climate change. There are growing concerns about the strength of democracies around the world. We see corruption in our financial system, and our Western diet is now making us sicker than it is making us healthy. We're seeing decreases in life expectancy. So I'm going to start by talking about how we got here. And my starting point is September 13th, 1970, when Milton Friedman published in the New York Times Magazine the Friedman Doctrine, which states that the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Now, Friedman's theory is actually very eloquent, and it's simple, and it addresses real problems of his time, both problems for the private sector and problems for society. Specifically, by focusing on profits, firms address issues of agency. As companies became bigger, as shareholders became more diffuse, it became more and more difficult to align the goals of management with the goals of owners. And so by focusing on profits, you can incentivize managers to maximize the profits that every owner wants. It also addresses problems of information. In free markets, capital will flow to the best ideas. And so there is little incentive for people to hide information. Basically, you should aggregate information up, you should share it, because if you have a great idea, the capital markets will fund it, you will become wealthy, you will pay that back to the capital markets, who will then fund the next great idea. And lastly, by focusing on profits, Friedman addresses the concern of illegitimacy. Owners choose managers not to reduce carbon emissions, not to solve social concerns, fix the social safety net. They hire them to run the operations of a business. And so when these managers delve into topics unrelated to profits, Friedman argues, they are wading into areas on which they are not experts, on which they are not representatives of the shareholders. And so when we see free markets functioning well, they aggregate information, again, distributes it throughout the market. There's no reason to hide this information. They're also dynamic and flexible. And a really salient and recent example of the flexibility of free markets is the pandemic. If you think about what happened in the early part of the 21st century, venture capital funds thought that mRNA technology had some promise, but it was unclear what that would be. They gave money to Moderna to develop this technology. Moderna went public a few years later, and my last day of class was March 12th, 2020. Before we shut down for the pandemic, I got my vaccine exactly 13 months later. And that really could not have happened without the free market. Free markets also satisfy heterogeneous preferences. It gives you the opportunity to invest in where you believe your most value will be created. And lastly, it promotes meritocracy. Again, in the free market, capital will flow to the best ideas. So any kind of bias will create inefficiencies. And I can't see anyone there, but I imagine some of you are shaking your head vigorously from side to side right now. And I'll get there, I promise. But these benefits create two really important results. First, they lead to prosperity because resources are allocated efficiently. The best ideas get funding, and they stimulate innovation because everyone has incentives to create the next great idea, because you know that the free market will support that idea. And perhaps most importantly, the benefits of free markets lead to freedom, because individuals can choose their own means of livelihood, and power and prosperity is distributed, which distributes power. And this is a really important part of Friedman's argument, and it also situates it in its time. So I'm a child of the 80s. When I think of the 80s, I think of Rocky IV. It's Rocky versus Ivan, and that's really what every movie was about. Communism was the big threat of Friedman's time. From the 70s until the fall of the Berlin Wall, communism was the existential threat that we were facing in our democratic society. And Friedman argued that corporations have an obligation to strengthen democracy. And they do this through profit maximization, because it's not just about maximizing profits that Friedman says. He says they maximize profits, and then they distribute those profits to owners and let the owners choose how they should invest them to make the world a better place. And the argument is basically that distributed profits distributes wealth distributes power, and distributed power is a fundamental necessity of a democratic society. But Friedman also made some important assumptions here. So that well-functioning markets must have property rights. You buy something, you own it, and it's protected. You have to have complete knowledge. Everybody's operating under the same beliefs, the same amount of information. Contracts need to be enforceable. You can't have agency conflicts, and there can't be collusion among for-profit organizations. So now I want to address the head shakers in the room, because there are some very valid critiques of free markets. First, externalities in public goods. Markets get distorted. They only work in the sense that they generate prosperity and freedom if there's perfect information, open entry, and importantly, that prices reflect all costs. And we know at this point that this is not true. The problems of climate change, accelerating inequality illustrate that these conditions aren't sustainable, that they're not holding. And we're starting to realize that the costs may be dire. Second, there's the problem of distribution. So markets by design generate inequality. Benjamin Applebaum, who is a reporter for the New York Times, he wrote a book about the development of the free market theory with a focus on Friedman. And he has this great quotation in there where he says, "Capitalism is a competition and money is the prize." We believe that in order for capitalism to function, we have to have some inequality. The best ideas need to get funded. Those people will become wealthy, while those with lesser ideas will become less wealthy or poor. Some will be lucky, some will be harder working than others, but this kind of inequality incentivizes innovation. But we need to understand that there's legitimate inequality And then there's illegitimate inequality, but it's really difficult to identify that. And so we continue to ask ourselves, how do we feel about a world in which the benefits from increased prosperity go overwhelmingly to the top 1%, which is the world we're living in today? Another critique is that Friedman's theory and the follow-ons to Friedman's theory have no real description of how institutions can be created to curb the market's bad behaviors. And some have hoped that markets would generate these for themselves because the market demands it or their self-interest, but we really haven't seen that effectively. And in fact, we tend to see that markets chafe against these institutions. In fact, we see that institutions have actually decayed under free market capitalism in the 21st century. And this is an increasing concern that's being driven by uncontrolled markets. We see lobbying for rules and regulations that advantage corporations. This is the real fear of crony capitalism. And in addition, markets don't just change these observable institutions, they change the inobservable ones too. Markets, shift our cultural norms and values. We see this growing focus on the individual, on consumption, and on what can be measured. I mean, we see this, I'm talking about this at the micro level, but we see it at the macro level too. There's this push to move away from GDP because it doesn't necessarily capture the well-being of society. It captures the physical growth of society. We also see this shift from the whole and a shift from the long term onto things, and a shift away from things that can't be easily measured, like happiness, like the well-being of our ecosystem. It's very easy to dump on markets, but we have to ask ourselves, are they close enough? No market's going to be perfect. Are markets achieving the goals we set out for them to achieve? There's a lot of evidence that free markets are correlated with prosperity and political and economic freedom. And central planning, which tends to be the antithesis of the free market, has not successfully worked in the 20th or 21st century. So what's the fix? Again, centrally coordinated government action, we're seeing more and more of that, but we don't get clear answers on how much governments should be involved, on what issues should they weigh in, and on which should they let the free markets address it themselves, and how should these issues be governed. Self-regulation is another interesting way in which markets might be able to correct themselves, but it's really hard. So in the mid-2010s, Unilever had a big push to create sustainable palm oil across the entire consumer packaged good industry. Palm oil is used in so many products. It's incredibly dirty. It's horrible for the environment. And it looked like things were going to work. But with self-regulation, again and again, we see the prisoner's dilemma. We see that companies acting together, or private sector entities in general acting together, will benefit everyone. Everyone will grow, but the advantages of deviation are also really high. And so there's always this temptation to deviate. And so we haven't really seen a concrete, long-lasting way in which industry coordination, government coordination has worked. I've been working on a case about an organization called Ownership Works, which is seeking to address wealth inequality in the private equity space. And they're checking a bunch of the boxes to try to address this. So they're having real commitments. So firms have to give money to belong to this organization. They have to institute practices that the whole organization thinks will help to address wealth inequality. And they are using auditing. You have to provide data on how effective you are and who's benefiting. And lastly, if you don't abide by it, you get kicked out. So there's some kind of credible punishment. But it's very early days. One of the aspects of this case that I'm really excited about is the question of what's going to happen down the road. Lastly, another potential fix is changing the goals of business by changing ownership and governance, which I'll talk about in a little while, metrics and information. We need to think about what we're measuring, as well as legal structures. So what can business do to fix itself? Before we start there, we should ask, should companies act? There's a growing consensus that the answer is yes. So Edelman does an annual survey of people around the world. And in 2022 was the first year that more than half of people around the world said that capitalism in the form it's in today is doing more damage than good, which is, again, hugely concerning. People are losing faith in the system that we have that's really generated the prosperity that we live in. In addition, despite that, these surveys also show that there's growing belief that business can act, that CEOs have an obligation to address these big societal issues. And there's a gap in trust. People tend to trust the private sector more than they do their governments. And this is something that happens in a majority of countries that are surveyed. But even in the US, politicians are making the argument that we need business to act. So John Podesta, who is now serving as the US Senior Advisor on Climate Change in the Biden administration, recently said that private sector capital flows, that's where the real money is. We're talking billions when we need trillions of dollars to solve this problem. We've got to unlock that private sector capacity for people to make investments in building a clean energy future, or else we'll miss both the development goals and the climate goals. It's basically saying that governments are not going to be able to effectively address these big problems alone. And in order for us to avert crisis, we need to create ways in which the private sector can address these big problems. So should owners want to act? This depends on your definition of owner. In 1970, the typical owner was an individual investing in individual stocks to save for retirement and earn passive income through dividends. And Friedman argued that regardless of the heterogeneous preferences of these owners, they should all want to be richer. So you can disagree on whether whether cigarettes should be sold to minors or not. You can disagree on how you should distribute healthcare. But if you're investing in these stocks, you're doing so in part because you want to make more money. Now, a fairly influential new paper by Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales argues that the growing focus on ESG is driven by shareholders' desire for welfare maximization. In other words, it's not about profit maximization, it's about well-being. I want to invest not just to make money, but to make myself be able to sleep better at night. And to give you an example of what this looks like in reality, when Paul Pullman became the CEO of Unilever in 2015, he announced this push toward a sustainable strategy of sustainability. The share price plummeted. And he responded by saying, if you buy into this long-term value creation model, which is equitable, which is shared, which is sustainable, then come and invest with us. If you don't buy into this, I respect you as a human being, but don't put your money in our company. It's basically shopping for the shareholders he wants. He's exploiting that idea of heterogeneous preferences and saying that it doesn't matter, you have opportunities to invest wherever you want. This is where our company's going. This is where we think we're going to create value. And for the most part, he was right. Unilever significantly outperformed its peers for several years. And in recent years, we've seen the company struggle a bit. A lot of people have attributed that to this exact strategy. But at the same time, we've seen all of Unilever's competitors piggybacking and following similar strategies. So it's really unfair to make that accusation. There's just not enough evidence to support that claim. It's not just about getting the owners you want. The actual definition of owner has significantly changed in the last 20 years. In 1998, the total net assets of mutual funds worldwide was about $5 trillion. Today, it's almost $30 trillion. And much of that is controlled by Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, and State Street. I think it's about $23 million of that, $23 trillion of that is controlled by those big four. And this has huge consequences for how we think about capitalism, the obligation of the firm, because these companies, these asset owners are the largest shareholders of every company in the world. And so they don't care if Apple beats Google. What they care about, because they're going to make money either way, what they care about is the stability of the system. They care about systemic risk. And so therefore, they are increasingly less concerned about short-term profitability and much more concerned that these companies are doing their part to make sure that there is a technology sector 20, 30, 40 years down the road. And the critique here, which is partly valid, is that this is anti-democratic. We have intensely concentrated power in the hands of a very few. When you think of the CEOs of these 4 asset owners, they are basically making decisions that affect the lives of all of us. They're not democratically elected. They're not beholden to anyone other than their shareholders. But in reality, they're also beholden to their customers, which are all of us. And what we want from them, the product that we're buying from these asset owners is retirement. We're putting money into these companies, which then invest our money largely in passive index funds, so that when we're ready to retire, we can live comfortably. And so again, that is aligning the customer's needs with the operations of the firm, the asset owners, by pushing these companies to think long-term. And long-term is partly profits, but it's also preserving democracy, which companies can definitely play a role in. It's thinking about how they impact the environment and mitigating damage. And it's thinking about having stable societies. So owners should care. How do we get managers to care? Now, I'm an accountant by training, so whatever you ask me, my answer is always going to be measurement. And that's the case here. Measurement is a really important part of this that is lagging. So there was a 2017 article in the Wall Street Journal asking, is Tesla or Exxon more sustainable? It depends whom you ask. What they find in here is that there are a small number of large ESG ratings agencies on which investors depend to make decisions about the social behavior of corporations. And the problem is that they do their ratings through a largely black box methodology. And so it's hard to tell how they're coming to their conclusions. But if you look at one of them, Tesla was ranked as the most sustainable, the best automaker for the environment. Another one put Tesla as one of the worst automakers for the environment. The problems here are multiple. First, it's that we're leaving this to the private sector. These companies have incentives that are not necessarily perfectly aligned with society's incentives toward getting companies to act more socially responsible. Another issue is that there's just no regulation. Companies are disclosing what they want to disclose. So part of my research is looking at ESG reports in the United States. This has become the clearinghouse for where companies report on their environmental, social, and governance activities. Basically, they report on how good or bad they are for the environment, how good or bad they are for employees. And it's really not how good or bad they are if you're reading these reports. It's really how great they are for all of these things. Because companies are not required to talk about anything in specific for these disclosures. They can talk about whatever they want. And for the most part, they are talking about all the great things they're doing. And to give you an example, a very cynical example, Goldman Sachs's 2021 ESG report, the cover has a picture of smokestacks with pretty green leaves spouting from the top. So there is still very valid concerns that these disclosures are marketing material. And yet, this is the best we have. This is what we as a society, we as customers of the large asset owners are investing in. So there is a long road ahead, but there's two problems. Well, one problem is that it takes a long time to develop a measurement system. We think that we've been talking about this issue from the corporate perspective for about 10 years. Modern financial statements were developed more than a century ago, and we're still trying to figure them out. The rules for how do you recognize revenue, which is perhaps the most simple measure in all of financial accounting, just had a significant change a few years ago. And so to expect us to have good and accurate measurement right away is unrealistic. That being said, given the severity of the problem, we definitely need to work harder to address it. largely because measurement defines our values. And we have to be careful because measurement systems can create perverse incentives. So there have been two big disclosure changes in the United States to combat inequality through measurement and disclosure. There in the 1934 Securities and Exchange Act, companies were required to disclose the pay of their top executive, their chief executive officer. The reason for this was that at a time when 25% of the population was out of work, these CEOs were making lots of money, and through disclosure, we could shame them into lowering their salaries. But in reality, as Alexander Moss at Princeton found, it didn't work out that way. What happened instead was that the CEOs who weren't being paid the top saw what all their peers were making, went to their boards and said, hey, this is unfair. I'm just as good as the next guy. You need to raise my salary. And that's what happened. We see an increase in their salaries. So in my dissertation, I look at the most recent disclosure on inequality, which was the CEO pay ratio. This arose as part of Dodd-Frank, the Dodd-Frank Act, which was spawned by the financial crisis of 2008. Robert Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, who was the architect of this CEO pay ratio, argued that it would be an opportunity for shareholders to think about how fair pay is within an organization. But it didn't work out that way. What happened was, I'll just give you an example. So Hasbro and Mattel, I don't know, for people like me who don't have children, these are commodities. It's like, going to a Chevron gas station versus an Exxon gas station. They make toys, they're all the same. You'd expect them to have very similar pay structures. The CEO pay ratio for Mattel is one of the highest of all publicly traded firms in the United States. It's above 1,500 to 1. The pay ratio for Hasbro is one of the lowest. It was 76 to 1 in 2020. You look at these, on the surface, it might just be that, well, Hasbro is a much better employer. But in reality, the only difference is that Mattel owns most of its manufacturing facilities overseas in Asia, whereas Hasbro outsources. So it's just an accounting trick. And so in my dissertation, what I do is I use granular worker level data provided by the US government. And so I look at the characteristics of workers and their pay to get an understanding of what drives pay. So again, I talked about how capitalism is a competition. Money is the prize. We expect some kind of inequality, and there can be good inequality. I look at the kind of work people do, the education they need to do it, the performance of their firm, and a host of other characteristics. And from that, I'm able to extract, the expected pay, the pay that these workers would get if everyone was working at the same firm and the economy was truly fair. And I find that when you have inequality driven by what I call economic pay disparity, firm performance increases. So again, this kind of inequality leads to better firm performance. But when I look at pay that's unexplained by these economic factors, so this is pay disparity that's likely driven by systemic biases, again, depending on race or gender, the rent-seeking behaviors of executives who have outsized control in setting their own pay. I find that this kind of pay disparity leads to higher turnover, lower worker satisfaction, and lower firm performance. And interestingly, it's not just driven by the numerator, by the CEO being unfairly paid too much, or by the workers getting paid too little. It's the combination of both that really drives these results. And I just threw, a complicated 70-page paper at you in about 40 seconds, and I don't expect you to understand it all, but the key takeaway here is that measuring these issues is incredibly complex. We tend to want heuristics. We want easy answers like the CEO pay ratio, which can garner headlines, but doesn't have a ton of meaning behind it. And so we need to we need to step slowly. We need to think carefully about these measurement systems to avoid this. But once we have good measurement systems, it allows us to benchmark. And this helps us define accountability. It helps us mitigate threats to measure, and mitigates threats to measuring hard issues. Once we have this measurement, we can measure hard issues, albeit imperfectly, but we can measure them. and then we can track them over time. We can improve on the underlying issue while we improve our measurement systems. Now, there's growing talk of standards, both in the US and in the EU. The EU, it looks like it's really going to happen. We're really going to see better disclosures, uniform disclosures across companies on environmental and social issues. In the United States, it's still a coin toss. It's great because this creates reliability. It basically means companies are signing on the dotted line saying, we swear that what we're saying here is true. It allows for a comparison across firms and across time so we can track progress. But it ignores idiosyncrasies. It becomes less relevant. And again, if you think about financial accounting, you could write a 100-page accounting book for every single company that would be different than every other company. But instead, we rely on a set of generally accepted accounting principles, which are general by definition, but you miss a lot of the nuance. And so it's very imperfect. But that's the trade-off we need to have. And I'll show you a little bit why. Because as I said, regulators, standard setters, they're working towards creating uniform disclosures. In the United States in 2020, the Securities and Exchange Commission actually changed the rules. They now required firms to disclose material threats to their human capital as well as their human capital strategy. And it's interesting because prior to this rule, the loose rule, or the hard rule, I should say, was that firms should disclose to their investors anything that's financially material. We would argue that human capital is probably financially material for pretty much every firm, and yet prior to the passage of this rule, not a single publicly traded firm in the US had a section on human capital. After the passage of this rule, in a study that I have, we find that 86% of firms had a disclosure on human capital. They're starting to disclose quantitative information, which we believe is more reliable. It's easier to act on. But with this rule, the SEC was really careful. They took what's called a principles-based approach. They said, instead of making hard and fast rules saying you have to disclose X, Y, and Z, they said, we're not even going to define human capital. It varies by firm. And so each firm is going to be able to define it on its own. And you can choose what you want to disclose, which again makes it really hard to compare. We find that actually on the quantitative side, firms did increase their quantitative disclosures, but they're disclosing over 9 different topics. So it's, some firms are disclosing on diversity within the firm, others are disclosing turnover information, others are disclosing information about health and safety. And so again, principles-based approach gets us part of the way, but probably is unlikely to be fully effective. As I've said, time is not on our side for effective regulation, but it is clear that there's a need both from the supply side and the demand side. Basically, investors want this and firms want guidance. So voluntary ESG reports in the United States as a form of disclosure among publicly traded firms have increased by 760% in a decade. And not only that, they're actually becoming more financially material. What I mean by that is firms are talking less about the fluffy stuff like charity work that doesn't necessarily relate to value creation, and talking more and more about how ESG is intertwined with the financial health of the firm. Investors are also really starting to pressure companies to improve their disclosures in the absence of regulation, and we're seeing some really effective ways of doing this. For example, State Street, the big asset owner that I mentioned earlier, they are now requiring firms to disclose what's called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission disclosure. So every firm in the United States has to report to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission detailed information about the diversity of their workforce. How many women and minorities there are in management, how pay differs across these different groups, but they do it confidentially. State Street's arguing that there's no reason to keep this information confidential, and they believe that there is valuable human capital information in these disclosures. And so they are increasingly rolling out decisions to vote against corporate boards that refuse to make this information public. Last but not least, fiduciary duty. This is one of the big pushbacks, that firms have a fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value. The truth is that fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and good faith are owed to shareholders and to the corporation. And that's an important distinction there, because the corporation is a separate entity from the shareholders. The corporation includes the community in which it operates. It includes its employees. It includes the environment on which it relies. And so for the most part, this doesn't necessarily mean shareholder maximization. Ultimately, what corporations owe their stakeholders are what their stakeholders need to operate in and preserve a well-functioning society. In 1970, the free market was the ideal weapon corporations could use to fight communism. Today, we need new tools to combat environmental threats, social unrest, and rising authoritarianism. And I'll leave you on an optimistic note, because it's not like we need to reinvent the wheel. This image is from page 2 of General Motors' 1958 annual report. It's basically how General Motors takes care of its stakeholders. The pie chart represents a dollar in revenue. So we can think of this as what percentage of revenue goes to each of its stakeholders. It pays 51 cents to suppliers, 3.5 cents to working capital, basically keeping the company running. It pays 4.5 cents to shareholders through dividends, 2.5 cents to repairing equipment, pays the government 10.5 cents, and it pays employees 28 cents. We suffer from present bias. We tend to think of the capitalist system that we have today as the capitalist system as it always was. But that's not the case. Immediately after World War II, this country was devastated. And the private sector really stepped up. They tended to employ a lot of people. They paid them well. They talked openly about how they had an obligation to shareholders, but often that wasn't their first obligation. They had obligations to their customers, they had obligations to their employees, and they had obligations to their communities. That's a world we were in. We have the foundations for getting to a similar world today. We just need to start implementing it. So with that, thank you so much. I will stop sharing my screen, and I am happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Ethan. I will get started with some submitted questions in the Q&A. Entered from Eric. Is wealth inequality an inevitable outcome of capitalism? Is there any research on this?
So it is an inevitable outcome of capitalism. And to give you a way of thinking about it, we are an audience of Harvard people. We have most likely invested a lot in our educations, and we've been rewarded for that investment. It is a lot less likely that if we were to get paid all the same, we would all aspire to get masters and PhDs and all the like. And so wealth inequality is an inevitability. Again, the tension is about how much is too much. And there is Thomas Piketty has done tons of research and makes available amazing data on the growth in wealth inequality. There is a lot of research showing that there is a connection between capitalism and wealth inequality. There is a lot less showing where there's a good balance. What is an ideal amount of inequality within a society?
Great. And our next question comes from Susan. There was a Washington Post article today about a dark money group targeting investment firms that include ESG metrics and measures of success. As a result, Vanguard, who you referenced, quit a coalition called the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance and shelved its own modest pledges to cut the amount of greenhouse gas emissions linked to companies in which it invests. Doesn't this cut against your argument that the market works to promote long-term sustainability goods?
Yeah, it's a great question, Susan. And I struggle with what people are saying publicly and what's actually happening privately, because in my interactions with a lot of these large asset owners, they're steps away from ESG principles, is more an attempt to avoid wading into the political muck of these issues. When I have these conversations with them, they confidentially, or off the record, I should say, the general consensus is that we are going to keep doing things the way we've been doing them for the last decade. We're just not going to talk about it as openly. It's not about, they believe that this is the free market working well. It's not necessarily, the value that they're going to create, the opportunities they're going to have are going to be in investing in solving these long-term problems. And so while they might step away from these organizations, their investment principles inside these firms are unlikely to change.
A question from Coulter. This was a great presentation about where things are. Are there any challenges beyond authoritarianism and sustainability that you anticipate in the future?
I hope not, Coulter. I'm already having a hard time sleeping with just those two. No, I think I think inequality is the other one that I wrestle with. I mean, that's my area of research as well. Inequality is definitely interrelated with climate change, with authoritarianism. But again, it's wrestling with, is it good or bad? I ask that of my students every year. We start debating this, and I say, well, is inequality good or bad? And usually the knee-jerk reaction is inequality is bad. And then I point out to them, you're paying a lot of money to be here so that you will eventually contribute to this bad inequality on the numerator side. You'll be you aspire to be in the upper percentile, and they really wrestle with it. And so I teach a case on TJX, they own TJ Maxx and Marshalls and Sierra Trading Post, and they have their CEO is superb. He's done a very good job of leading this company through challenging times. They have a lot of low-wage workers. Their pay ratio is more than 1,000 to 1. And so we wrestle with this, and and one of the things I ask them is they start by saying, yes, this is horrible. They should do something to address this huge pay ratio. And then I say, well, let's say they decide to set a ceiling for pay, and you're graduating, and they come to you and say, hey, you are a stellar student. We'd like you to lead strategy for this company. We're willing to pay you $75,000. Would you take the job? Nobody's going to say yes. So that's where we are.
The next question comes from Asher. Disclosure rules are something that corporations obviously have a lot of interest in, while the average citizen has probably minimal interest. To what extent do you think lobbying is a concern for getting impactful, toothy disclosure rules created?
Oh, Asher, I'm an accountant. I operate under the assumption that everybody's interested in disclosure and measurement. But I do think that I think that this is it's all going to come down to lobbying. And actually, let me start again. It's not all going to come down to lobbying. A big component is going to come down to lobbying, and the other is going to be investor pressure. And we're seeing that investor pressure every year. Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, in his letter, talks about the need for better disclosures, talks about how they are going to start voting against companies that don't disclose under Sustainable Accounting Standards Board standards. So at this point, pretty much all of the success has come from the investor pressure, not from lobbying. Although at the same time, we can't see the lobbying side because the lobbying tends to be against these kinds of disclosures. Companies tend to be hostile to any additional disclosures. So I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be a mix. I think that if I had a crystal ball, if I had perfect foresight, the world I'd envision is one where the European Union creates a set of standards that are so onerous for US firms that in order to do business in the EU, the US publicly traded firms have to disclose this information as well. And it will leave US regulators behind, but it will also achieve the goal that we're set out to achieve.
The next question comes from Akalesh. Don't you think the problem is that capitalism is defined as our ends rather than means to allocate capital efficiently? Akalesh is an enthusiastic capitalist when it comes to means, but a socialist when it comes to ends. What do you think?
I don't really know the answer to that. I don't, again, like I started by saying, I don't think that capitalism is necessarily the problem. It is what we have. It's what it would be like saying, food is the problem. It's not that food is the problem. It's that, what we choose within those foods is the problem. And so I don't think that it's that capitalism is too focused on the ends versus the means. I think that within the system that we operate, there are powerful actors that focus too much on the ends. But I think there's also a distortion in the reality there. So I talk in my course about short-termism, and in general, people tend to think that managers are focused on the short term, that they have all this investor pressure to make their quarterly earnings. And in reality, that's not the case. Most investors really think about the long term. They pressure managers to think about the long term, but there's this perception that short-termism is what owners want. And so I think the perception is a little distorted.
Monty would like to know, in this new paradigm suggested specific to corporate governance in an open free market economy, does a place exist for ethical behavior in the doing least harm regardless of profit?
So Monty, I teach at Harvard Business School, not at the Kennedy School or the Karl Marx School. So I have to think, like, I have to make arguments and I have to believe that you can address these problems profitably. And there's two ways this is going to happen. It's going to happen through old players, reassessing how they do business. But more than that, it's going to happen through disruption. And that's where the free market is so good. The free market is really good at disrupting the old order. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see, if you think about, I don't know how many of you interact with people in their 20s these days, but these people are coming out of these schools with a real sense that it isn't all about profits, that they acknowledge that their sacrifices are going to be made. But if we make small sacrifices now, we can avoid bigger sacrifices later. And you see articles about this all the time. ExxonMobil is having a horrible time recruiting right now because nobody wants to go work in oil. No MBA students want to go work in oil and gas anymore. It's becoming a real problem for these older industries.
Monty would like to point out that they are an HKS alum, so thank you for that answer. Our next question is a little bit longer with some context, comes from Marcy. As someone who's been involved in the shareholder activism, responsible ownership, corporate governance movement since about 1983, Marcy knows well the evolution. Kudos for elevating past principles and practices to today. A lot is happening regarding materiality, metrics, both for public equity, but also increasingly other portfolio asset classes. What are your thoughts regarding A, responsible ownership from the asset owner perspective across portfolio, especially on the part of tax-exempt institutional investors that have what you could call a civic fiduciary duty to operate in exchange for their tax exemption?
You've caught me in trying to pass off old ideas as something new, because I know that there has been this movement for decades. So on that note, I've actually seen this starting to happen. So I've been working, I wrote a case about KKR and their push to employee ownership. So what KKR has done is they started as a test pilot. They're actually rolling it out pretty widely now. When they buy a company, they're giving a percentage of ownership to the entire employee base. So every employee becomes an owner of the company. And the first example of this fully happening, they actually just exited. It was an amazing story. I was there for the announcement. There were people crying. It was amazing because it was a company, a garage door manufacturer in rural Illinois, 800 employees with an average salary of $48,000 each. These employees wound up splitting $360 million among them. So like life-changing wealth for these people. In addition, it was KKR's best exit in 30 years, their best investment in 30 years. And I came to this thinking, oh, that's, it's a fascinating story. It's a feel-good story. It's an employee story, which I care about, but it is also very much a story of these asset owners, these tax-exempt institutional investors, because these are the biggest investors in private equity. And up until recently, there's a conflict between their civic fiduciary duty and their fiscal fiduciary duty. And by taking steps like this, by again trying to share the wealth of private equity investment with these blue collar workers, they're starting to address that.
Part B of Marcy's question: what are your thoughts on the context, or rather impact, of responsible ownership investing, especially where multi-capitals are involved besides financial capital, social capital, human capital, natural capital, built environmental capital, and even spiritual capital.
I'll resort to managerial accounting concepts here and think about the trade-off between the span of control and the span of accountability. So what this suggests is that you want to, the goal is you have a span of control, you have a span of things that you actually have control over, and then there are the things that you're responsible for. And to design this well, this is an idea created by my colleague Bob Simon. You want to create what's called the entrepreneurial gap. You want to hold people accountable for a little more than they have control over. And that forces them to be innovative and forces them to go out and think outside of the box. And so there are a host of different issues about which firms, about which investors should care, but we don't want to throw so much at people that we wind up getting nothing.
And Asher has a follow-up question. Regarding Fink's pressure to have better disclosures, do ESG funds from major asset managers vote in a measurably different way on climate-related board issues compared to non-ESG funds? The research Asher has done seems to say no, but he'd love if you could point him in a different direction.
So it's is paradox the right word here, Asher? Basically, we have a problem. It's that our disclosures aren't good enough that we can really effectively judge climate-related disclosures, climate-related issues, and yet there's so much demand for responsible investing that they're being created before they have the tools to create them. And so I agree. I have not found any compelling research that says that ESG funds tend to vote or act in ways that are consistent with their underlying principles. They tend to rely on bad data to make judgments, not always because they are nefarious, but just because that's all the data they have. And so I'm optimistic that this will change over time. Going back to an earlier point, I think a lot of this is going to be driven by privately held companies and private investors, such as the private equity industry, which has, can act as an authoritarian. They can go into a company and say, we want these disclosures, we want to take these initiatives. At KKR, for example, they are recognizing billions of dollars in savings just doing energy audits, which is totally falls into the ESG space. They go into a company, they say, look, let's do better insulation, let's do more thoughtful, internal climate, and they're saving billions of dollars every year doing this. Hopefully this will start to spill over into the public sector where we get these better disclosures, where firms start to talk in ways that are meaningful to investors using quantitative information, compelling information that can help us make investment judgment, but we are not there yet.
And what will probably be our last question, how can these impact measures be applied in the world of education, in your opinion?
So how can they be applied in the world of education? I think, do you mean that, can I ask for a clarification? Do you mean how do we apply it to the education industry, or how do we educate people to do this?
A little bit of both.
Okay. Well, how can we apply to the education industry? I worked with a company that was it was an education publishing company that was trying to become actively anti-racist in its curriculum. And in order to do that, it wanted to think about the impact it could have. And so we did a thought experiment where we thought about, what is the probability that a student who sees him or herself in the curriculum will perform better in school? And there's actually evidence to suggest that's the case. So let's say it increases the probability of graduation by 5%. Then we can say, well, that would lead to X number of people graduating high school that wouldn't have graduated had they not had access to these materials. And we know that the difference in salary between someone graduating high school and someone dropping out is about $150,000 over 10 years. And so we do multiply that $150,000 times the number of people we impact. And that's how it would work in the education industry. How we teach this stuff is we need to start by going to foundational principles. We need to say, what do we care about? At the end of the day, do we as individuals care about how much money we made, or do we care about how we left the world a better place? And if it's the latter, which most people would say is the case, then we actually need to get to the mechanics of that. We need to think about what we're measuring now, how we can change that measurement, how we can change the systems that determine that measurement, and start to build that foundation.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you to all of those who were able to join us this evening. We hope you'll join us for more signature events soon. Good night, everyone. Thank you for joining.